be remiss of me not to ask you about that chant, because it's all over the news.
Death to the IDF!
What did you think when you saw a very large crowd of largely privileged Britons making such a cry?
The barriers coming down and the lack of pretense to this sort of unbridled Jew hate. Education has been at the forefront of so much of this for so long. This is something that has been brushed under the carpet. I taught at a school in 2008. The students were coming out with things like, McDonald's pays the Jews to kill all the Arabs. That school became famous, and 5 years later, that was the school that these 3 girls left to join ISIS.
I did want to ask you about some of your own experiences in the media.
The moment that they are actually confronted with facts, reality, data, statistics, there seems to be a kind of system error, this kind of meltdown that we have seen.
Be careful what you're saying.
I beg your pardon. It also occurred with Ian Dale, I'm afraid, on LBC.
Okay, you've done it 3 times now, goodbye.
They don't want their worldview, in a sense, shattered.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Natasha Hausdorff. Natasha, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brendan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you on. I've wanted to talk to you for a long time. I know we've spoken to you at Spike before. I feel like we need an injection of calm, legal, reasoned thinking into the discussion about Israel, and you're the perfect person for that. Listeners and viewers will be familiar with your work for the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. They will have seen you on TV, making the calm, reasoned case for what's really going on between Israel and Hamas in the war in Gaza. So I want to ask you about all of that stuff, but I guess I want to kick off by asking you a broader question about how you think the public discussion about Israel stands right now. Because to my mind, it's always pretty bad. Sometimes it's really bad. I wonder how you think it is now after Glastonbury, the Palestine Action controversy, ongoing protests. I mean, all the craziness is not going away. Where do you think it stands now in terms of the public understanding of Israel?
Well, I'm sorry to say that it has been deteriorating extremely rapidly, but that is perhaps unsurprising given the misinformed basis upon which this discussion has been taking place for so long. And that ultimately, and I know I'm talking to one of the exceptions here, but ultimately I put that at the responsibility of the media. Certainly for the last 20 months, but of course for, frankly, decades before, we have had a media that for the most part appears to be complicit in propagating the propaganda of terrorist organizations. And that has come to a head in everything that we have seen being reported, in particular out of Gaza, which is, of course, controlled by Hamas. And ultimately, it is that misinformation that has been informing, or perhaps disinforming, the public debate. And we've seen it deteriorate as a direct result into these chants for genocide. Again, nothing new. And let's be clear that what was shouted at Glastonbury, death to the IDF, essentially calling for death to Jews, it is simply an evolution of the from the river to the sea chants that we've heard simply from the 7th of October onwards, and indeed, in fact, before that also. And because that has become acceptable, it's become almost entrenched, we're seeing further variations on that theme of essentially genocide against the Jews.
So just sticking with this for one moment, it would be remiss of me not to ask you about that chant, because it's all over the news, death to the IDF, and it's causing a huge controversy, a lot of discussion. Some people you will have seen are saying it's not a call to kill Jews. It's just a cry of opposition to the IDF. People are trying to make that case. What does it mean to you? What do you think? Well, what did you think when you saw a very large crowd of largely privileged Britons making such a cry? And what do you think the consequences of it would be if such a thing were ever to come to pass?
Well, in a legal sense, I saw offences under the Public Order Act, and UK Lawyers for Israel has reported both the act involved, but also the BBC to the police on that basis. But on a sort of broader, perhaps more moral sense, I saw a deterioration of public understanding, but also the barriers coming down and the lack of pretense to this sort of unbridled Jew hate. I mean, Glastonbury has now for many years become a very unwelcome place for Jews and Israelis. There are anecdotal reports of Israelis who have attended feeling extremely intimidated by the flags that are being waved. I think there was even a Hitler flag being displayed on some of the tents. That was reported a couple of days ago. So that general change in sentiment is deeply, deeply concerning, but I think only the tip of the iceberg when one thinks of where the allies of these people have been demonstrating sometimes on a weekly basis, calling for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from certain parts of the world, calling for genocide. There are many, many people who've been swept up in this because they think it is the fashionable thing. It is the way that one demonstrates one's moral credentials by essentially joining forces with internationally prescribed terrorist organizations and, saying, frankly, criminal things like up Hamas and up Hezbollah, both of which are prescribed in this country. But we're seeing more and more, I'm afraid, gullible individuals being taken in. And I think the groundwork for that ultimately has to be the misreporting that I referred to in response to your first question. But it does seem to be tapping into something more deep, to prejudices and to, I'd say, sentiment that I think we hoped had evaporated several decades ago. That's all now very much in the forefront of where I think the support for death to the Jews comes from.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it feels like the moral guardrails have come down, and that kind of latent anti-Semitism that many of us suspected was there for a long time in this kind of obsessive hatred for Israel, that is coming much more to the fore. It feels like it's kind of open season now, whereas in the past things tended to be a little bit more coded, a little bit more carefully put, but now it's a lot more frank. Okay, so one of the reasons people say they hate Israel, and we've heard this post-Glastonbury in the discussion that's going on now, is because it's a genocidal entity. So I really want to get into this with you because you, in my mind, are the clearest voice on this question. This defamation, I would say, or this accusation, as others would say, that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. I mean, that falls from the mouths of virtually every leftist. You will see it in much of the media discussion. It's become a fashionable point of view to hold. You will hear it at dinner parties across England, people saying, yes, this is a genocide and we all have a moral responsibility to stand up against it. What's your response to this accusation that's being made against Israel right now?
Well, it is grotesque. It has no basis in reality whatsoever, but it is being advanced with a very particular purpose. I remember I was on SABC, the South African version of the BBC, just after South Africa had achieved this first provisional measures order against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And my counterpart said, in the context of this debate, isn't it marvellous? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence and nobody can tell us otherwise. And that, to me, epitomized the weaponization of this term and of legal processes at international courts and tribunals like the International Court of Justice in order to shift the Overton window here, in order to move the acceptable parameters of the debate. And we've seen the impact of that. That was January 2024. Since then, as you say, it has become the fashionable thing to accuse Israel of. Now, quite apart from the fact that I think most of these people believe themselves to be sounding intelligent using a word like this is a term that was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish jurist, to provide legal terminology to the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, where they were targeted for extermination because they were Jews. But this is a term that is being inverted. And here, Jewish Israelis are being accused of the very crimes that were committed against them. I don't just mean the crimes in the Holocaust against Jews. I also mean the real acts of genocide that were committed against Jews and Israelis and others on the 7th of October by genocidal terrorists, Hamas, that made no apology, that in fact celebrated their genocidal crimes on GoPro footage and spread it on social media around the world. And they were very clear about their intent on the 7th of October, which was to target Jews because they were Jews. And intent is the essence of the crime of genocide. Yeah. It's defined in Article 2 of the Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide. And it is the targeting of a group, a national, racial, religious or ethnic group as such, so because of who they are. And it is complete with acts of killing, or rendering the circumstances of life impossible. All of that was on full display on the 7th of October. And this practice, I mean, some have called it projection, right? Projecting the crimes that were committed against Jews onto the Jews themselves. But it is part of the pattern of what I see as the weaponization of international law as part of this modern acceptable face of anti-Semitism. You alluded, I think, in the beginning of some of your questions to this idea that this was now the acceptable form of anti-Semitism because it focuses on the Jewish state, not the Jewish race or the Jewish religion. But let's be clear about what mechanisms are being used to justify this new form of this old hatred. These labels. These, you say it's defamatory. In fact, it's unfortunate. Perhaps one cannot defame a country or government institutions, certainly under English law. And that is an important provision to enable freedom of speech and expression and the criticism that one ought to be able to see in a democracy. But here, what we are seeing is essentially ancient blood libels here in a modern, updated form. So in the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use their blood religious ritual. Here, these legal terms are being used to deploy the modern blood libels. We see it in occupation, in ethnic cleansing, in colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide. And it's all part and parcel of presenting, an acceptable face of anti-Semitism, but one that pseudo-intellectuals can sign up to, and quote violations of international law. I would ask any one of them which law they consider Israel to have been in breach of in any one of these respects. In my experience, they can't answer.
That's very well put, and it really leads me on nicely to some of the other questions I wanted to ask you on this issue in particular. So I guess I want to ask you firstly about how you will make the case that Israel is not committing a genocide. I mean, it's pretty obvious to you. It's pretty obvious to me. It's obvious to some of us more sensible people, I would say, but it won't be obvious to everyone out there where sadly they are believing some of this stuff. And then I guess I want to ask you why you think that particular accusation is made, which you've touched on there. So let's just start off with, you're a barrister. You work for the UK for lawyers. You do work for the UK for lawyers, UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. You talk about this stuff in depth. So give us your pitch as to why it is wrong, legally wrong, morally wrong, to say that what Israel is doing in relation to Hamas and Gaza is a genocide.
Well, I explained that the key aspect of the crime of genocide is the intention to target a group in whole or in part. What Israel has done from the outset is make clear its war aims to target Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations. But it has also, in its actions, done more than any army in the history of warfare to protect civilians on the ground in Gaza. You do not do that if your intention is to eradicate Palestinians. And it has done this in seeking to evacuate them. And if you actually hear interviews with Palestinians on the ground in Gaza, which are not controlled by Hamas, which are sadly not broadcast on the international media because, frankly, it doesn't fit with the agenda of the BBC, Sky, CNN, take your pick, they will say, and they have said, in particular, I recall interviews last November, Palestinians fleeing Jabalia with Ohad Chemo from Israel's Channel 12, who said, "Thank you, Israel. We are with you. Please defeat Hamas for us. You are providing us with humanitarian assistance, with humanitarian corridors." And we know that throughout the evacuation of civilians, and this was in particular reported at the very start of the Iron Swords War, that Israeli soldiers were in fact defending these evacuation corridors from Hamas fire. Hamas were firing onto Palestinian civilians seeking to leave areas in which Hamas had turned civilian infrastructure into terror strongholds. And flee to designated humanitarian zones like Al-Muwasi, and Hamas were seeking to shoot them because they didn't want to lose their human shields. Israeli soldiers were defending Palestinian civilians in that context. Also, they provide warnings of strikes. These strikes are subject to a proportionality assessment, and the aid that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip far exceeds the requirements of the civilian population. I know, not what one normally hears on the international media, but it's readily available public information that demonstrates this is the case, including on the Kogat website. If you Google Kogat Iron Swords, you'll see that there are over 1,800,000 tons of aid that have been facilitated into the Gaza Strip via this unit of the IDF that facilitates humanitarian assistance to civilians in armed conflict. This is the only role that this unit of the Israeli Defense Forces carries out. And we've seen independent studies that have also looked at the calorific content of that food aid. I know that the tonnage won't necessarily mean much to you or to me, but in a study that was conducted last year, between January and July, these nutritionists and academics determined that over 3,000 calories per Gazan per day had been facilitated into the Gaza Strip by Israel over the course of that period. Now, I think the NHS guidelines for an adult male are 2,500 calories per day. So given the volume of aid that has been facilitated in, the question ought to be, where has this aid gone if there are indeed shortages in the Gaza Strip? I think we also need to be taking note of many international organizations' reaction to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is a more recent initiative which delivers aid directly to civilians to prevent Hamas diversion. Now, we saw the UN, we saw Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other supposed aid organizations up in arms, telling Palestinian civilians not to access aid from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And this I found very telling. It indicates to me that all of these organizations have been continuing to provide succor to Hamas, both in their rhetoric and in their permitting, essentially, Hamas to continue to divert aid, humanitarian assistance over the last 20 months to fund its war machine against Israel. And these are the same organizations that were up in arms when the mechanism came along that would prevent Hamas from continuing to do so. So the allegations that we've heard of genocide from these sorts of organizations are part and parcel of this Hamas propaganda being propagated, not just by the media, but also by aid organizations that are now complicit with Hamas on the ground in Gaza, because frankly, they cannot operate in Gaza without Hamas allowing them to do so. But what all of this indicates very, very strongly is the complete opposite of genocide. That in fact, Israel uniquely here is the country in the world that has done more than any other to protect Palestinian civilians, to provide them with humanitarian assistance, to set up field hospitals to treat Palestinian civilians, including those that are shot by Hamas or that are injured when Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip, and they fall without a proportionality analysis. They kill indiscriminately. The bizarre state of affairs here is this, in this topsy-turvy world, all of this has been inverted, and Israel is painted out to be the villain here, despite the fact that if you ask ordinary Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, when they are able to speak freely without the threat of Hamas, torture and intimidation, they will speak the truth. It's just not something that we're hearing broadcast more broadly. So just in terms of the two elements of the crime of genocide, intention to target this group of people as such, but also the acts that are complained of, Israel is not targeting civilians. Israel is clear that it is targeting Hamas, and it has done so in unprecedented circumstances where Hamas has spent nearly 2 decades embedding its terror infrastructure within civilian areas, using every mosque, school and hospital as part of its command and control centers. And it is pretty important that we center onto this. This is not just a byproduct of Hamas's tactics, its modus operandi here, in seeking to hamstring Israel in its defense of the state of Israel and the Jewish people by putting civilians in the front line. This is actually part and parcel of Hamas's propaganda initiative to seek to generate as many civilian casualties as possible, because that is how it proposes to survive, with international pressure on Israel to cease its lawful, legitimate self-defense. And every time we hear this kind of rhetoric, not just from the media, but increasingly now from supposed allies of the state of Israel, you'll remember, of course, a few weeks ago, a statement by the UK, Canada and France promoting this canard of starvation, which is completely contrary to the publicly available information here. That gives Hamas succor. It elongates this war. It prolongs the conflict. It encourages Hamas to continue with the hope of survival. And that costs lives, Brendan, on both sides. All of these countries, officials, UN organizations that are providing Hamas support to continue, that are encouraging it to leave the negotiation table. And this was remarked upon, in fact, in a moment of blinding honesty by Antony Blinken, the former Secretary of State, towards the end of the last US administration, when he said every time there was daylight between the US and Israel, Hamas left the negotiation table. There are over 50 hostages still kept in Gaza as a result of this encouragement to Hamas, and there are Palestinian civilians that are undoubtedly losing their lives, as well as Israelis, as a result of this encouragement of Hamas. And it is exactly what these terrorist organizations have been hoping for.
Yeah, that's great clarity there. That I hope that will swing some minds towards the more reasoned case about what's going on. No one doubts that what's happening in Gaza is awful, and there is a great amount of suffering. War is always awful, which is one of the reasons some of us hate Hamas, because it started this war with its pogrom of 7th of October. But, what kind of genocide, as you say, entails advising civilians to leave areas where you're going to be fighting against your enemy, or importing food and aid, or providing medical assistance? I mean, it is just such a falsehood. It's extraordinary. And it really is the great lie of our age, isn't it? Because I mean that in the sense that it is a lie, in my view. The idea that Israel is committing genocide is a falsehood, but also in the sense that it is the lie that many, many, many people believe. It has spread around the world in a pretty terrifying way. So how do you explain that? How do you think something that is so clearly not true, that is so clearly an untruth and a grotesque untruth, how is it managed to convince so many people?
Well, there are a few factors here. One, I mentioned the ancient blood libel. I mean, that was pretty widely believed in its time. Of course, fewer people believe that Jews killed Christian children for their blood in the Middle Ages. And I'm hopeful that these modern blood libels, occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid and genocide will ultimately go the same way. But you're right that this is the widely believed modern lie. Part of that, as we've discussed, is the media coverage. Part of it, though, is what we see through these international organizations. I was recently in Copenhagen and in Oslo debating Amnesty International on their report accusing Israel of genocide. And frankly, the two representatives that were put up as part of this discussion, I don't think had in fact read the report, but I had. And I looked at the methodology section, in which the organization was plain that it did not have people on the ground in Gaza, so it relied on local government authorities. Hamas. The origin of this falsehood is there in black and white ink. And what happens when an organization like Amnesty International takes Hamas propaganda like this canard of genocide and puts it on a report with Amnesty International on the head of it? Well, then it gets reported by certain UN special rapporteurs, no prizes for guessing who. Then it gets recycled into UN Human Rights Council resolutions or General Assembly resolutions. Then it gets picked up by bodies like the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. And once they've referenced it, lo and behold, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch re-quote what the ICJ or the ICC have said, which came from their original laundering, if you will, of Hamas propaganda. And that cycle of disinformation it has been going for many, many decades. This latest example of genocide is essentially on the back of this practice becoming well established, and there are many other NGOs involved in this process. So in that respect, that's a key aspect which has fueled this great falsehood. But it's beyond doubt that it has fallen on fertile ground here. And ultimately, I think we come back. I know people get prickly when anti-Semitism is raised. We come back, though, to the fact that this is the oldest hatred. And no, all criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. There is a very, very straightforward way of discerning what is ultimately anti-Semitic and what is not. And that is where the truth lies. When there are falsehoods being spread about the Jewish people or about the Jewish state, and they are so quickly swallowed up and regurgitated and become chants in this fashion, and they lead to genocidal wishes on behalf of the people chanting them, it is essentially the fact that they are based on an untruth that makes that crosses the line into anti-Semitism. It is the fact that it is a label that makes it unacceptable. And I think so long as we have, unfortunately, international media, which is propagating so many of these untruths, that has had it ultimately baked into its operating systems, that this is the conclusion that is always jumped to, or this is the way that the media present these lines, then ultimately that's just going to fuel this big lie, as you've identified. I've spent some degree of time with Douglas Murray over the last year, and we've been touring together a little. And at one of the shows that we did, Douglas recounted that he had just been embedded with the IDF in Lebanon. And he mentioned the conversation he'd had with his fellow journalists who'd also been on this embed, who had said that they had to be very careful, of course, what they reported because of their colleagues in Beirut, and essentially what Hezbollah would do to their colleagues if they said the wrong thing. So long as we have international journalists, so-called, with plainly an abject absence of integrity, who are willing to self-censor according to what internationally prescribed terrorist organizations want them to say, be it Hamas or Hezbollah, we have a serious problem on our hands. And this is ultimately, in conjunction with these NGOs peddling these falsehoods, this is what is fueling this big lie. It is making it unbelievably pervasive. It is making it harder, I think, for ordinary people to stand up in opposition to it. And I think it's all the more important that people like you and people like me that understand the realities here encourage as many people as possible to push back on these falsehoods and to stand up for what is right in this equation. Because what starts with Israel will not end with Israel. And ultimately, this is a battle that Western civilization as a whole is fighting. These allegations against Israel, colonialism included, of course, we hear spread across university campuses in North America, but the UK included, being levied against Western liberal democracies. It is an attack on our very way of life. And it is certainly spread like wildfire amongst our young people. I think that ultimately comes down to a lack of purpose, which is on us, and to a lack of pride in the way of life that we are privileged to enjoy here in the West, and also a resolute determination to protect that, to protect it from attack. And the kind of mendacious falsehoods that we are hearing are just as dangerous as the physical violence, which unfortunately, undoubtedly, usually follows.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And to my mind, in relation to, as you say, of course, people can criticize Israel. I mean, go for it. But I very rarely hear normal criticism of Israel. I don't even know what it would sound like now, because what we hear about Israel all the time is hysteria, finger pointing, just, blind bigotry, that it's the most evil country in the world. And you start thinking to yourself, what would normal criticism of Israel sound like? Because it's so unusual to hear people make a calm critique of certain Israeli policies or certain government policies, because everything is so intensely furious and hateful and defamatory so quickly. To my mind, the thing that really makes the anti-Semitism accusation very apt in many of these cases is that a lot of what is said about the Jewish state directly echoes what was once said about the Jewish people. They love to kill children. They love to spill blood. They control world affairs. They've got their fingers in all the pies of governments across the world. It's so extraordinary to me that all the old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have kind of been projected onto the Jewish nation rather than onto the Jewish people in the way that they traditionally were. I did want to ask you about the war itself in Gaza, and just, you've talked about the media coverage, and I have had questions on the media coverage, but you've nicely weaved it in, because I agree with you that that is a serious, serious problem here. And one aspect of that problem is that we are so rarely told what's really happening in Gaza, not only in the sense of what you've said, which is that Israel is actually not targeting civilians and not carrying out a genocide, etc., but also what Israel is targeting in terms of Hamas and Hamas terrorists and Hamas fighters, many of whom have been killed, many of whom have successfully been taken out. The leaders, of course, but also a lot of the grunt men and the foot soldiers and the kind of people who invaded Israel on the 7th of October to rape and murder Jewish people. Hamas is often invisibilized in the media coverage. So you are left with this impression that the IDF is in Gaza just to kill Palestinian civilians. So tell us a bit about what's happening on the ground and the successes that Israel has had in this conflict that it's been compelled to fight with Hamas.
Well, when you consider the relative size of Gaza and Israel's military might, which has also, of course, been on display against Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy, and Iran itself, perhaps it's strange, or it might strike some as remarkable, that it has taken Israel 20 months and it's still not eradicated Hamas. And part of that is because of the unprecedented challenge that Israel has been faced with in pinpointing, targeting Hamas and its terror infrastructure, including its extremely well-established tunnel network, while protecting civilian life. That's ultimately why progress has been so slow. Frankly, if Israel wanted to take Hamas out without regard for proportionality, for the laws of armed conflict, then it would have done so far more quickly. So this sort of inverse approach that people are criticizing the war for taking so long, well, that is precisely because Israel has been so careful and meticulous about this. Now, that's not to say that there is not widespread destruction in Gaza. I was there on the ground in September with a military expert panel, and we saw a great degree of destruction because of the way that Hamas uses the Palestinian civilian infrastructure. We saw civilian houses that were booby-trapped, that were part and parcel also of the tunnel network. So these challenges that Israel has had to rise to over time, we had briefings, the military expert panel and I, while we were there, about the tunnel warfare. At the start of this war, it would be unthinkable that Israeli soldiers would go down into these tunnels. Even from a psychological perspective, it was just considered to be too dangerous. It was the unknown. Well, by September, as we understood it, Israel was fighting through the tunnels faster than it was fighting above ground, and often using Hamas's tunnel infrastructure to surprise terrorist units above ground. So that sort of changing of the tables takes time. Yeah. The meticulous nature of this operation plainly also takes time. And it is without question that Israeli soldiers have been losing their lives as a result of the very careful, painstaking approach that Israel has taken to pinpointing Hamas terrorists within civilian areas and seeking to minimize the destruction as much as possible. That was well documented, in fact, by military experts who had been on the ground with me, including Sir John McCall, a very senior member of the British Armed Forces, and Sir Major John Spencer from West Point, who heads up the urban armed conflict department there. He is perhaps the world's leading expert in urban armed conflict and has repeatedly said he's never seen anything like what Israel is having to grapple with. So I think that's a very important angle and part to bear in mind. In terms of the progression of this war, plainly stage 2, if you will, or phase 2, after the collapse of the ceasefire, when Hamas refused to continue releasing hostages, there has been a change, and Israel's approach has been to take and control territory within the Gaza Strip. Unlike the first stage of the war, where it was simply going in, dealing with Hamas terrorists, and then withdrawing. And that ultimately has been a change in fighting, and has caused more civilians to have to evacuate areas, some of which had already been evacuated, and civilians had been permitted back in. I do remark, though, on the border that Gaza has with Egypt, and how very different Israel's war in Gaza against Hamas would have been if Egypt would have complied with its obligations under international law and permitted the safe passage of those civilians fleeing civil disorder in Gaza. How different would it have been if there was a Palestinian humanitarian zone set up the other side of the border in Egyptian Rafah, where there is more space than anyone knows what to do with, where they could have been provided with humanitarian assistance without diversion to Hamas, where Hamas would not have been able to abuse humanitarian zones like it has done with al-Mawasi to fire missiles onto Israeli civilians. That simply wasn't done. And instead, uniquely, these Palestinian civilians, with the blessing of the international community, were forcibly kept in a war zone, not permitted to flee, again, providing succor to Hamas, providing support through maintaining its civilians as human shields, nay, frankly, human sacrifices. That is the policy that Hamas is seeking to pursue. And that is utterly remarkable. It is really something that I feel puts the lie to any person that claims to care about Palestinian civilians and has not called on Egypt to open its border, as I have been doing from October 2023. I can't marry that in my head, Brandon. And that is, frankly, when you ask about how Israel is conducting the war, that is a major, major challenge that Israel has had to navigate. Absent those civilians, had they been evacuated for the period of this armed conflict, of course, progress against Hamas would have looked completely different.
You know, the lack of criticism of Egypt and its failure to open its border has been one of the most striking things of the past 2 years. I mean, if you listen to the left in the West or the media in the West, the international organizations that you talked about earlier, so few of them have said anything at all about Egypt and its failure to take people in temporarily while Israel fights this war with Hamas. It is so striking. And I can't think of any other war in recent times where we haven't encouraged people, tragic as it is, to leave the country that is at war. You know, countries, when you're at war, there are refugees. Civilians leave, especially women and children, because we want to keep them safe. And that was actively discouraged in this case
or
by the people in...
There were people,
or blocked.
There were people who wanted to leave, who presented themselves at the border, and I think the going rate is something like $10,000. And unless you can bribe your way out of that reinforced Egyptian border fence, then you're stuck, and you are there, and they continue to be abused by Hamas. I've seen videos circulating this morning of the punishment that Hamas metes out to civilians that it accuses of being disloyal. That includes, of course, following evacuation orders or seeking to remove yourself from an area where Hamas is using civilian buildings as a stronghold. These people are tortured and executed, and that is something that the international community continues, for the most part, to remain silent on.
Yeah, you know, with the active blessing of people who claim to be pro-Palestinian, Palestinian women and children have been forced to stay in a war zone. I mean, it is just extraordinary and really exposes the cruelty of the Israelophobic mindset, which is that you're so obsessed with demonizing the Jewish state that you even lose sight of the importance of protecting civilian life when war happens. I wanted to ask you about the moral inversion in relation to all of this, which you touched on earlier. You mentioned that, you know, it was Israel that was subjected to an act of genocidal violence, and yet it's Israel that's accused of genocide. It was Israel that was invaded by an army of bigots and racists, people who are avowedly anti-Semitic, and yet it's Israel that is always accused of being a racist entity. it was Israel's people on the 7th of October 2023 who were subjected to indiscriminate barbarism, and yet it's Israel that is accused of doing that. I mean, the moral inversions just stack on top of each other. And I wanted to ask you about the moment, that immediate moment after 7th of October, how you felt about the response in the West to that, in terms of the protests against Israel that took place very quickly, the way the discussion became quite anti-Israel very quickly, even though it was Israel that was attacked. Were you surprised? Were you shocked? Were you alarmed at how quickly the focus turned on Israel, even though it was Israel that had just been attacked by a genocidal army?
Well, let's not forget, we're speaking from central London, and of course on Edgware Road, people were setting off fireworks and handing out baklava on the 7th of October. And unfortunately, we've seen similar atrocities. 9/11, of course, was being celebrated in a similar fashion in the West Bank. So that isn't surprising to anyone who has followed both national security policy, but also the public feeling in many of these places across the Middle East. And I think we need to be clear, though, about the reasons for that, which ultimately dovetail with the reasons for the perpetuation of the conflict, and that is indoctrination to terror, as well as incentivization to terror, notably through the Palestinian Authority Pay for Slay program. Perhaps we can come back to that. But it is education, Brendan, which is at the center of this. And I have to, I'm afraid, draw the parallel to education here and across the West. That is why I was not surprised by the immediate inversion and the immediate sort of finger pointing, as you say, at Israel, despite the fact that, as it has consistently been in, Iran's decades-long proxy war against Israel, that the victim here, but of course in the kind of colonized canard and framework that is projected onto Israel, which is a further inversion, that can never be allowed to be the case. Jews are considered to be white, even though anyone who has been to Israel will know that that couldn't be further from the case. They're considered to be the colonizers as opposed to the indigenous population. Anyone who has the remotest interest in archaeology will also know that is not the case. So it is education which has been at the forefront of so much of this for so long. And I feel this is something that has been brushed under the carpet. I taught at a school in 2008, and I was part of a charity called Debate Mate. We were setting up debating societies at Teach First schools. So for the most part, these were failing inner city schools. And I taught at Bethnal Green Technology College, where in amongst the conversations about current affairs, the students were coming out with things like McDonald's pays the Jews to kill all the Arabs. And I sought to challenge and push back and encourage some critical thinking. But I did speak to my link teacher about my concerns. And she told me it was even worse than I fully appreciated. She couldn't study set texts with the children at this school in the centre of London for GCSE, which included The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, the Holocaust from a child's perspective, because, she said, they kept coming out with things like, if only Hitler were here today, he'd sort out the Jews once and for all. Now, I could tell that only a few of the school members, of the pupils, were bringing this sort of sentiment from home, but unchecked, unchallenged, the rest of the class would go back thinking this, and it was becoming a breeding ground for extremism in the centre of London. I wrote about my experiences that summer, actually. I worked at the Centre for Social Cohesion alongside Douglas Murray. And of course, nothing was done. But that school became famous some 5 years later. It had changed its name to Bethnal Green Academy, but that was the school that these three girls left to join ISIS. And so when I talk about education, I'm not just talking about what is the moral rot that is taking hold at universities. I'm talking about the hotbeds of extremism and radicalization that have been at play in city centre schools. And this was just one experience that I happened to have teaching on this particular programme. I'm sure because of the complacency with which this was viewed, that this is not an isolated incident. And that shapes the public discourse when these individuals grow up and start to vote. And therefore, it also shapes the political discourse. And everything we have seen, unfortunately, from the current government in terms of supporting UNRWA, refunding it, despite complicity with Hamas, despite Emily Damari telling the Prime Minister on a phone call, I was held in an UNRWA facility. We've seen an arms embargo initiated against Israel, I think on an unlawful basis because of the legal reasoning that has been made public by the government. And we have seen encouragement through the rhetoric of this government, unfortunately for the terrorists in this equation. That is part of this, whole network, if you will, of this symbiotic processes of disinformation which have been at play.
Yeah, the education contribution is incredibly concerning. And lots of teachers in France as well have raised the fact that they find it very difficult to talk about the Holocaust with their students because they know there will be pushback. Students will say it didn't happen. Why are we talking about this? I mean, it's incredibly worrying when that kind of culture takes hold in schools, which are supposed to be turning out responsible, good citizens for the future. That reminds me of something I wanted to ask you, and you've just mentioned UNRWA there. And I think the Emily Damari example is just not spoken about enough. The fact that we live under a government that reintroduced funding for UNRWA while a British citizen was being held in an UNRWA facility in Gaza. I mean, just staggering, really. But what is the role that education plays through UNRWA schools, largely, in Gaza, and then also in the West Bank as well? In fact, we shouldn't let the Palestinian Authority off the hook in relation to all of this. What role does education play in terms of, I guess, inculcating the next generation of Palestinians, innocent Palestinian kids who otherwise might get a pretty good education if it wasn't for their teachers and the school system? What role does it play in inculcating them with the kind of hatreds that then later turn into something more violent, maybe even terrorism?
The most significant role in perpetuating this conflict. This is what it all comes down to. The fact that Palestinian kids are taught from kindergarten up that the highest calling in life is to become a martyr and to kill as many Jews as possible. And the fact that this is reinforced through every facet of Palestinian society. You've got football clubs named after so-called martyrs, terrorists who have blown themselves up in discotheques or pizzerias, murdering innocents. You have arithmetic that is taught through adding up numbers of martyrs. You have physics that is taught on the basis of how to use a slingshot. You have Palestinian Authority Kids TV, where a bumblebee explains that the trees will come to life and reveal the hiding Jews behind them and encourage the kids to pick up knives and to stab them. This is pervasive. It is child abuse, but it is also at the core of what it is that is preventing peace in the Middle East. We've seen so many initiatives, pieces of paper, handshakes in the Rose Garden of the White House. All of this, I'm afraid, is utterly meaningless. While you still have generation after generation that is having instilled in them that the essence of Palestinian nationalism is the annihilation of Israel. This is what Yasser Arafat essentially gave birth to with the Palestine Liberation Organization, the flag of the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority, which came out of it, subscribes still to this national ethos. It is what UNRWA also embodies in this so-called right of return that it advocates for. Why is the Palestinian Arab the only refugee that is recognized generation after generation? In any other context, a refugee is settled in a country and their children become recognized citizens or residents of that entity. Not here, because for the last 70 years, this idea of Palestinian refugee status has been held by Israel's surrounding Arab countries, for the most part, as the sort of axe over Israel, that once, frankly, the Jews are pushed into the sea, which is the rhetoric that we used to hear frequently on Arab media, these so-called refugees would be settled in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, and that this projection of the destruction of the State of Israel still sits at the heart of so much of this education program. It is supported by the pay-for-slay policy, which I mentioned, that is paid by the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates in this equation. And they pay salaries, Brendan, dependent on how many Jews terrorists have been able to slaughter. The severity of the sentence marks an increase in the stipend. The organisers of the 7th of October atrocities, including Ali Kadi, the head of the Nukhba force, was in receipt of a Palestinian Authority stipend for the 2 years that he was planning the 7th of October attacks. The connection here is undeniable, and the fact that the international community continues to fund this level of indoctrination and this incentivization to terror, because it does fund the Palestinian Authority, is quite frankly disgraceful, shameful, objectionable. It ultimately means that all of these so-called allies of the State of Israel, so-called proponents of the Palestinian cause, they ultimately have blood on their hands. And it is the continuation of these misguided policies that are dragging this conflict out and that are pushing peace further away, both for Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, and in relation to that, that's very well put. And it's made me think over the past few weeks and few months, in fact, about the slogan "Free, Free Palestine," which you hear all the time now. We heard it at Glastonbury, of course. You hear it on the streets all the time. You hear it on every campus. And I've started thinking about how stupid that slogan is, because, the impression the slogan gives, of course, is that Israel has got its jackboot on the Palestinians. It's thwarting Palestinian statehood. It's the block to the flourishing of a Palestinian nation, or the flourishing just of Palestinian society. And therefore, the elimination of Israel is the precondition for Palestinian freedom. I mean, we hear that now, not just from members of the PA and, of course, Hamas, but also from people in the West. They now say from the river to the sea, which means the erasure of Israel and the erasure of the Jews in the Middle East. But Free, Free Palestine, what it overlooks, of course, whether for reasons of stupidity or malice, is that the Palestinian leadership and Arab leaders more broadly have continually rejected offers to live in peace next to the Jewish state, and have very often opted for violence instead. So that kind of quite recent history from 48 onwards is just not understood at all by people in the West, is it?
Well, this major misrepresentation also gets the current reality totally wrong. The Palestinians have self-governance. They've had self-governance in Gaza since 2005, since every Jew was ethnically cleansed from the Gaza Strip. We've seen the result of that. But they've also had self-governance in the West Bank, in areas A and B, under the Palestinian Authority, which was created under the 1995 Oslo Accord. So it's just utterly extraordinary that there can be this, accusation of you'll recall that occupation was one of the canards that I included in that sort of weaponization and misrepresentation, inversion and abuse of international law. It is not borne out by the facts and by the reality. Now, international law does not give anyone a right to a state. If it did, of course, the Kurds would have had a state long ago. There would be hundreds more states. International law is actually very well established on this point. Peoples are expected to self-determine and self-govern within existing territorial frameworks. But in this respect, the Palestinians have in fact been given territory that they never had. The Gaza Strip and areas A and B of the West Bank were under the proper application of international law and the universal rule of uti possidetis iuris, were in fact within the borders of the State of Israel when it declared independence in 1948. They were in turn occupied by Egypt and by Jordan between 1949 and 1967. And then ultimately Israel recovered that territory. But it is in these disputed areas, if you will, that Palestinian self-governance has been fully established. That is the remarkable thing. That is not good enough for people who are, in effect, calling from the river to the sea for the annihilation of Israel and for the ethnic cleansing of Jews. And the true mind-boggling development of this is that the International Court of Justice only last year called for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. also called the West Bank after Jordan's occupation of it, it called for the removal of Jews living in these areas. Now, it's important to recognize that Gaza in 2005 was ethnically cleansed of Jews. It was made Judenrein. Yeah. They even dug up the graves of Jews so that they would not be desecrated upon the withdrawal of Israel from that territory. Areas A and B of the West Bank are also Jew-free, Judenrein. And what the international community is calling for is more and more territory within Israel to be evacuated of Jews, ethnically cleansed in this nature. And that has somehow become respectable, a respectable call, not just in the context of these misguided protesters that we're discussing, but also within the weaponization of the International Court of Justice. Now, that is what I call extremely alarming for Western interests more broadly, because once these international courts become political courts, essentially, become weaponized and used for these political agendas, then rule of law countries like the UK, the US, won't be able to rely on them going forward.
Okay, Natasha, just a couple more things I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about Iran. And we've mentioned Iran, and you've mentioned that there's been a proxy war, and of course Hezbollah being one of Iran's main proxies, and Hamas as well. Israel has recently struck at Iran and taken out a huge chunk of its leadership, a huge chunk of the theocratic government there. America joined that action briefly and dropped bombs on nuclear sites. The first thing everyone said, of course, is that this was an illegal, unprovoked war by Israel. The monster is off its leash again and doing things to innocent countries like Iran. I mean, to my mind, that was just ludicrous, because Iran over the past 2 years, and prior to that, of course, has attacked Israel either directly or through its proxies many, many, many times. And this current war started when an Iranian proxy of 6,000 armed men invaded Israel on the 7th of October. So it's ludicrous to my mind, but what was your response as someone who is a barrister and works for the UK for Lawyers Charitable Trust and talks about these questions of legality a lot? What was your response to when Israel struck Iran over the past couple of weeks?
Well, I would differ from you ever so slightly on the legal analysis here. You're right that this is a war that has been going on for some time. It has in fact been a matter of decades, and that has comprised Iran's proxy war through Hamas, through Hezbollah, its direct strikes on Israel last year included. So what occurred on the 7th of October was, if you will, another stage in this war, and what occurred when Israel struck Iran was a further stage in this ongoing war. But that analysis is important because part of the reason I think that some people have been falsely calling these strikes illegal is that they have viewed Israel's conduct, specifically in targeting Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile installations, in a vacuum, in isolation, and without the context of this ongoing war. In an international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, there are two big areas called jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum governs the start and end of wars, and jus in bello governs the conduct within a war. Now, frankly, we are and have been for many decades jus in bello here, in this context of an ongoing armed conflict, and therefore the proper legal questions are the broad ones that govern the conduct of armed conflict, the principles of military necessity, proportionality, distinction, and precaution. Those are the same principles that Israel has continually upheld throughout its war in the Gaza Strip against Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations. But here it has been striking Iranian military installations, perfectly legitimate military targets. It has been doing so in a way that is proportionate. All of Israel's strikes are subject to that proportionality analysis. It has been distinguishing, of course, between civilians and combatants because it has been targeting military infrastructure. And it has also been issuing warnings to the extent that civilian areas are nearby. They have been evacuated, most importantly, Tehran, suburbs there, and methods of encouraging civilians to evacuate include hacking the radio waves in Iran and broadcasting messages as well as text messages and phone calls to householders there. So pretty remarkable and unprecedented measures that Israel has taken, not just to comply with the laws of armed conflict, but to go well above the application of these laws and to set standards that many other moral armies will actually struggle to emulate. So that is the proper legal analysis. But the fact that one has seen this knee-jerk reaction, including, if reports are to be believed, in the legal advice deployed by Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, indicates to me something very different. This is not the proper application of international law. This is, in fact, the use of pseudo-international law or claims about international law to support a political agenda here. And it is the same political agenda that we have seen pervasive through the media coverage, the same political agenda we had seen through these NGOs parroting Hamas propaganda, and the same political agenda that we have seen, unfortunately, with this government seeming to give succor to Hamas and support the terrorists as against our key ally, the only democracy in the Middle East. And so when we see international law being abused in this fashion to provide a sort of headline or give succor or support to this particular political agenda, I have grave concerns, in addition to those I addressed you on earlier, about what is happening to the way international law is being discussed and represented in these fora.
Yeah, everyone loses when the law is turned into a political cudgel. I mean, that just doesn't benefit anyone. If you're interested in the law being, a reasoned tool to settle conflicts or resolve disputes, then it just is not helpful when it's turned into this weapon against Israel, which is what's happening so often these days. Okay, Natasha, let's just finish with something you've mentioned many times, and it's an issue close to my heart as well, which is our messed up media landscape and the role that the media plays in relation to all of this. And I did want to ask you about some of your own experiences in the media. People will have seen you on TV many times. You're out there fighting the good fight. People will have seen you struggling to get a word in edgeways with Piers Morgan, and they will have seen you on other things as well. And they may have seen your clash with Emily Thornberry at the Parliamentary Committee. Not necessarily a media place, but still an interesting clash. What have those experiences been like? What have they told you about, I guess, what you're up against when not only do you struggle not only is it hard sometimes to convince people, and it is hard to convince people, but it's hard even to say something often.
They've actually been quite instructive to me, because it does appear to me that when I do present frankly, what are the facts and the law, which is quite simple and straightforward to do because this is the reality of the situation. There seems to be a kind of system error. And part of that I appreciate is that for many of these people, they've actually never heard the reality before, because absolutely everyone else that they have on is repeating the same sort of terror propaganda. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. They're on with the received wisdom, and they're just repeating, the agenda that these either, I'm afraid to say, Foreign Affairs Committee or broadcasters want to put out. But the moment that they are actually confronted with facts, reality, data, statistics, and all of this, I have to say, is open source. I mean, I study the material, but I don't have access to any secret information here. If journalists were actually doing their job, they would be as clued up on these issues as I am. But this system error, this kind of meltdown that we have seen, it also occurred with Ian Dale, I'm afraid, on LBC, is something of a pattern. And it suggests to me that we have to absolutely redouble our efforts, and more people need to be speaking up about this. I cannot be the first person that these respective anchors and interviewers are hearing this from. Now, I fully appreciate that they are reluctant to have me on, and I fully appreciate that even when they have me on, they are reluctant to allow me to speak because they don't want their worldview, in a sense, what they have projected, certainly for the last 20 months, to be so very quickly shattered, as it inevitably has to be when faced with the reality and with the facts. But it indicates to me that, people like you, Brendan, you are doing such a phenomenal job here. And thank you so much for allowing me to give, perhaps longer, lengthier answers that then would necessarily be the ideal. But there is a great deal of ground to cover. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Opportunities like this are so important. The work that you and other journalists with integrity are doing is so important. And I think the more people that are raising the facts and the reality, the more likely we are to overcome this kind of system error, this meltdown. And I do believe that the truth will out, because when people realize that they have had the wool pulled over their eyes, there is undoubtedly going to be a reaction here. When people realize not only that, but, this is not just Israel's fight. Ultimately, the West is next here, and that we have to pick up the mantle. We have to call out these falsehoods and hold those that spread these falsehoods to account, because ultimately this is a war that is very much focused on us and our way of life. And we should be, frankly, extremely grateful to Israel, not just for what it has done in saving the free world against the nihilistic agenda of the mullahs in Tehran, but also in defeating, as it has done so far, the terror proxies of those mullahs, who make it perfectly clear, they're after the big Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, but, the medium-sized Satans, the UK and Europe, feature in there also. So that's the important message I think we all need to be repeating as much as possible, so that we overcome that system error, that meltdown, and so that people around the UK in particular are able to see the truth.
Natasha, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan.